Hi, my name is Ray.
Hi, this is Michael.
And we're doing our episode of Ray's Economics Booklet. Today, talk about monopsony.
Okay.
So, like a monopoly, a monopsony is basically a labor market where there's only one buyer, or one company that's employing or hiring.
Yeah.
So, if you look in the original labor market, factors were four factors, right? Land, labor, contribution, capital. When it comes to labor, factors paid is the equilibrium value of the marginal revenue product. Basically, where marginal revenue product, or the basic demand curve for labor, meets the marginal cost.
Yeah.
Marginal cost of labor right here, or basically our marginal factor cost or our wage level, basically.
Yeah. Actually, we just discussed in the previous episode. Just give you some, refreshment, and just want to make sure that fact is paid the equivalent value of its MRP. Yeah. Basically, it follows the generic, formula like MC equals MR.
Yeah.
Okay. So, let's see.
So basically, in a regular competitive labor market, the demand curve or the marginal revenue product would basically meet the supply curve of labor. Basically, the supply curve of labor is willing to work at different wages, and wherever they meet is where the current wage level is. Wherever the current wage level is also where the employer decides the amount of labor hired at QC. However, when there's only one individual or one firm hiring in a market, or as a monopsony, or much like a monopoly over labor, basically, there is a separate curve. So remember, in a monopoly, the monopoly has separate demand curve and a separate marginal revenue curve. When a monopsony is basically the exact same except flipped on the other side. The hirer, the employer, a firm, has a supply curve for labor, basically a supply curve of laborers, and from that supply curve, the marginal factor curve. There's a reason we have a marginal factor curve, the exact same reason we have a marginal revenue curve off the demand curve in a monopoly. We have an marginal factor cost curve from a supply curve in a monopsony because, as the only hirer or employer in the region or in the market, the firm, if it wants to hire more workers, it has to increase wages for all workers, assuming that wages are equal for every worker. Yeah. So this creates a mathematical need for a different curve from the original supply curve, since the monopsonist or the firm that's the only employer in the region in the market is a wage maker, not a wage taker. Sure. Their actions affect the overall wages of the market, and so in order to increase employment, they have to themselves increase wages as well, which creates a separate MFC curve. Exactly.
And now we can see actually based on the principle that MFC must equal MRP under the optimal hiring condition, right?
So much like how monopoly is a price maker, not a price taker, a monopsonist is a wage maker, not a wage taker. Now, one mistake many people often make when looking at a monopsonist market for labor here is that since the MFC curve intersecting with the demand curve or the marginal revenue product curve is where they determine the quantity of labor hired, which is obviously less than the quantity of labor hired in a perfect competitive labor market, right here. Obviously, there's less labor hired in a monopsonist market because the MFC curve is different from the supply curve. They also assume that that this is our wage level. However, that's not true. Remember, as a monopsonist, as the employer in the market, you obviously would like to have a lower cost for labor or lower wages paid if possible, if the laborers are willing to take it. And so the labor market supply curve, or the wages that laborers are willing to work at, is on the supply curve right here. And so we see here that our wage level here would actually be at PM right here. Yes. The reason because laborers are willing to work at wage point PM at point C. And so obviously the monopsonist will then pay them at that wage level they're willing to take at point C right here at wage PM instead of all the way up at price or at wage P. And so point C right here, PM, will be our wage level in a monopsonist market, where the supply curve, supply curve's quantity demanded meets to where the quantity demanded for labor is in the overall monopsonist market.
Sure. Yes. So it's just like in the monopoly market, the monopoly firm will actually charge higher price, right? So on the flip side, for a monopoly employer, they're going to pay the lower price.
So when it comes to wages and quantity of labor hired, since there's less labor hired in a monopsony market, in a monopsonist labor market, that's one factor or one part of our deadweight loss. However, since there's also a lower wage pay in a monopsonist labor market, that's the other part of our deadweight loss. So overall, that creates our overall deadweight loss right here, which is this triangle right here. This surplus of both surplus of demand and supply lost in a monopsonist market.
Yeah, so the total surplus actually, being reduced by this deadweight loss. It's pretty, simple to figure it out.
Yeah.
So since we have discussed, so many deadweight loss in economics, so yeah.
So obviously, most people probably assume in a regular labor market, minimum wage might create many issues. For instance, it might create a shortage of labor, perhaps. However, in a monopsonist market, this is because there's a separate MFC curve or MC curve from our supply curve.
Yeah.
In this case, since there's only one firm hiring the monopsonist, basically their demand curve, their supply curve is not their marginal cost curve. There are two separate things. That creates an interesting dilemma. Well, first of all, we see in a regular monopsonist market, in a regular demand market, in a regular labor market, we see this would be our point of labor right here, and our wage right here.
Yep.
However, the monopsonist hired at where MC meets our marginal revenue product. So they will hire at point L, pay only wage W right here.
Yeah, as we just discussed in the last slide. So yeah.
So let's say the monopsonist paying wage W right here, supply curve at production point, or labor hiring at quantity L. However, then we have a minimum wage loss, and where the minimum wage is W / right here.
Yep.
Well, if that's the case, our wage is higher than the current wage a monopsonist is paying.
Sure.
And so, because of that, a monopsonist will then redirect its labor practices to hire where marginal cost equals marginal revenue product.
Again,
curve. However, in this case, marginal cost is now a different curve. This curve, in marginal cost curve, is no longer the marginal cost curve that monopsonists use. Instead, it uses the new minimum wage law or minimum wage level as its new marginal cost curve. So this is become its new marginal cost curve. And so at that point, the marginal cost meets the marginal revenue product curve at point A. And so it will hire now L / amount of workers. And so we see here there's actually an increase in the amount of labor hired, and there's also an increase obviously in the wage as well.
Yep, and that's because wage has been mandated.
Yeah.
Okay, and based on our the marginal revenue, the marginal product, the demand curve, and the marginal cost, the new marginal cost curve, the optimal hiring condition becomes L /. So it's actually increased employment, but it's still less than point B. Yeah, because the point B is still what? Still the competitive market, right? Because we have this minimum wage, we could have supplied so many labors, okay? But our real hiring is only L /. Okay, but based on the supply labor curve, it could be we don't have the label here, but it should be like a L L EP, right? So based on this, we can say actually it's still what? Underemployed.
Yes, and the result, there's still a certain amount of deadweight loss, even with the minimum wage law in effect. However, the deadweight loss is reduced from a pure monopsonist market.
Sure.
So for our final clue today, factor is paid the equilibrium value of its marginal revenue product. This factor today we're talking about is labor. In a monopsony market, where only one buyer of factors like labor exists, such as a mining town, for instance, in a West Virginia, for instance, there are many coal miners that only have one coal miner employer, there are lower wages and lower employment. There is deadweight loss as a result of the lower wage and lower employment compared to a competitive factor market or a perfectly competitive factor market that could be analogous to a perfectly competitive industry.
Sure.
And so minimum wages actually may increase employment in a monopsonist market. However, there is still a certain level of deadweight loss and underemployment with the minimum wage. It cannot completely eliminate deadweight loss.
Sure, as we just discussed. So that's pretty interesting. So all this actually creates, when we say the factor is paid the equilibrium value of its MRP, it's not necessarily just labor, right? You could apply like a capital or land factors into the same logics, and we can still find the key economic principle is the marginal cost equals marginal revenue produced, which is the optimal economic condition. Okay, see you next time. Bye bye.